Hi, everyone. So here's the Stuff of Poetry lecture, which I think is going to be short. I know I say that every week, but this one, I really think it's going to be short. So let's just get started. Mostly I just want to talk about almost like an introduction to the poems we're going to read. So here, of poetry. This is my favorite definition of poetry, which is a thing that people always have a very hard time defining, both poets and non-poets. And it has nothing to do with length, or like the use of the line, or sort of the pretty language, or subject matter, or whatever. And it's W.H. Auden, who's a British poet from the early 20th century. And he said that poetry is memorable speech. And what's great about it is, it's succinct. You know, the shorter your definition, usually the better it is. And then two, it breaks down to what poetry needs to do. No matter what the form is or whatever you want to write about, there are two things. One, poetry is meant to be remembered or memorizable. The first poems were spoken. This is sort of poetry predates writing in a lot of ways. And they were told, and they were meant to be remembered and memorized. So there was a lot of rhyme and rhythm, not in ancient Greece, but, it was a kind of song almost, and that rhyme and rhythm helped in memorization. These days we don't do that as much with poetry, but there's just newer, different forms of memorability, if you will. The other thing that is implied by this definition is that poetry is concerned with voice and sound, which is definitely true. One way to think about it, even though it says speech here, is that like the voice I'm speaking to you with is kind of think of it as like a prosaic voice. It's like the prose. It's like writing an essay or a story. When you write poetry, what happens to your writing is sort of like what happens to your voice when you start to sing, which I'm going to spare you and not sing at you right now. But something happens to the human voice when it's told to sing, and that sort of shift. What you're doing is kind of like what happens to your writing when you shift to poetry. Yes, there's very prosaic kinds of language, but it's that sound and that key focusing on language that is at the center of poetry. And in fact, so one thing is that in poetry, sound and meaning are united, right? And language is so specific and so important that poetry becomes kind of the most self-referential of all of the genres, right? It's about poems are all in ways about poetry. If you think of it, if they're concerned with language, they are themselves made of language, right? So it's this like using language to draw attention to itself and to sort of point out certain effects and what they might mean, or what they might be doing to the meaning of the poem. Let's look at some examples, because I'm talking very abstract here. But the key thing is, because of this, don't look for meaning in a poem, look for doing. What is it doing as an object, as a thing? So here's a line or an idea that you could put in a poem. It's not that great. Poetry is weird. It's true, but there's no singing here. There's nothing memorable about this speech. Compare it with this from Alicia Ostriker. The poem is insane. It ties tin cans to its tail. It's just sort of, I guess, on one level, a more poetic way of saying the same thing. But you can hear it, right? The poem is insane. It ties tin cans to its tail, right? There's a lot of sonic effects going on that we've looked at earlier in this semester. Alliteration, assonance, all that stuff. But it just, it has an effect when you hear it. And I guess the point here that I'm trying to tell you is that all poetry that you write should be read aloud, and you should be paying attention to what sort of sonic effects are going on in the poems. So in this way, not only does this show, like this is just telling, right? Poetry is weird. It's just an idea. It's abstract. Here's an image, right? It's like a cat or something. It ties tin cans to its tail itself, right? Which is a sort of insane thing to do. It's an image, so it shows and doesn't tell. But on top of that, poetry can't just show. It has to show and then make some music, right? It has to have the really concrete imagery, but on top of that, sonic effects and voices going on. So another example of this is let me just read to you. I'll read this one. I don't want to do just one. This is Frank O'Hara reading for tomorrow, for Tuesday. And this is his poem, To the Harbor Master. And just don't worry about what it means or what it's saying or what it's even doing. Just listen to it and how it sounds. I wanted to be sure to reach you, though my ship was on the way, it got caught in some moorings. I am always tying up and then deciding to depart. in storms and at sunset, with the metallic coils of the tide around my fathomless arms, I am unable to understand the forms of my vanity, or I am hard a lee with my Polish rudder in my hand and the sun sinking. To you I offer my hull and the tattered cordage of my will. The terrible channels where the tide drives me against the brown lips of the reeds are not all behind me, yet I trust the sanity of my vessel, and if it sinks, it may well be an answer to the reasoning of the eternal voices, the waves which have kept me from reaching you. Again, so this is sort of what's memorable about this speech is that nothing's just sort of flat out said the way we would say it in everyday speech, everyday speaking. Something, O'Hara does stuff with sound and just certain word choices. There's a succinctness to the language that just makes it kind of reverberate in ways that poetry requires. And again, Frank O'Hara himself and other people will use more prosaic styles, but something else is going on to make it memorable. So with your poems, there's lots of options for how to go about it, but I want to just focus on two. In this class, at least, you could do other kinds of like concrete poetry, which is a sort of language making a picture on the page. But here we've got the narrative and the lyric. Narrative you know about from sort of our work with fiction and other parts of the semester. But to apply it to poetry, things to remember is that poems are narrated by the speaker, right? This is the term that we use. It could be a form of you, right? It's not you, you're a person. This I that you create on the page is immediately separate and artificial, right? Or it could be a persona. Zach Schomburg's poems that we're reading for today, he has this kind of persona that he uses, mostly because it's all very surrealistic, so it can't possibly be real. So he creates a person in the narrator, and this I becomes, we're trying to figure out that the narrative poems who this person is. They have characters, setting, action, all that stuff that you remember from narrative, but they're not tied to a scene or a plot. You don't need to have a conflict, any of that stuff, right? That said, some growth or change must occur by the end. They'll have their own kind of arc, and each one is different. So just think about narrative as an option for poetry when you read O'Hara's The Day the Lady Died and Schomburg's The Whale. The other option is the lyric poetry, which, lyrics are like in songs. So in many ways, the lyric poem is sort of like singing, the kind of pose you take when you do it. Lyric poems are often concerned with just one image, object, or idea. They just want to kind of capture it or interrogate it or what have you. And they don't move that much, just very, very small and subtly. That said, some movement is required, right? There's often a turn or shift that happens at the end, which we've seen in past poems. And I want you to take a look for how the lyric poems move and shift in O'Hara's To the Harbor Master, which I just read to you, and Schomburg's Far from Marlene. So read these poems, these two poets. Frank O'Hara lived and died in the sort of middle part of the 20th century. Zach Schomburg's still alive and quite young, and his work is really interesting, I think, and different for what people think about with poetry. And yeah, that's all. I will see you all on Tuesday.